On Tuesday, April 10th, Albany Public Library partnered with the Historic Albany Foundation to present The History of Albany's Streetcar to a packed auditorium at the Washington Avenue branch. If you missed the event, stay tuned. This episode of the Albany Made podcast features highlights from this program in Part 1, and Part 2 features highlights from the following night's program, Albany Archives, The Full Story. Part 1 features Tony Opelka sharing his expertise on local history. During the day, Tony works as a historic preservation program analyst for the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. He's been researching Albany's streetcar system for over 40 years. In 1977, he co-authored a report titled A History of Local Transit in the City of Albany and Its Impact on Certain City Neighborhoods. And we have a copy of that report in our local history collection.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for turning out tonight. I'm not asking because I want to know anyone's age, but I want to know if anyone here, and I know there's at least one person here who rode the trolleys in Albany. Okay, so we have a few. That's good. I was actually expecting to have fewer people who had a personal experience with them. And I have to admit, I did not have a personal experience with them. So what I want to do is talk about what the point of this research was. Back in 1977, when I worked with a SUNY student on this, the idea was to try and understand more than just the historical development of the lines, but what impact they had on the growth of the city. My own background is in architectural history and city planning, so this was kind of an approach that I thought, well, it's nice to know when they were built, how long they ran, and so on. But I wanted to know what impact they had on the physical development of the city. A book had recently come out by 1977 that did a study of the Boston system, and it was called Streetcar Suburbs. And that phrase seemed to have caught on because a lot of places now refer to neighborhoods that developed along trolley lines as streetcar suburbs. So we're going to have our own streetcar suburb talk here in Albany. The first line actually began running in 1863, but the company that ran that line was incorporated in 1862. So I want to start by talking about what the city was like prior to that period. And I don't know how visible this map is, but the map that's hanging on the front of this podium dates from 1857. You can see that the city ran pretty much from the river to about Lark Street with a couple of exceptions. And those exceptions were the two turnpikes, which are now known as Western Avenue and Central Avenue. And it grew north and south along the river and near the mouth of the Erie Canal, which was just below North Albany. And it grew down to the south end, almost as far as 2nd Avenue. So the city was pretty much on the flat part of town, except for Madison Avenue, State Street, and Clinton Avenue as well. So people were in what was called what's referred to as a walking city, where you walk to everything. You walk to your place of employment, you walk to your residence, and you walk to any other things that you had to do in your life. But at the time of the Civil War, the city began to grow by leaps and bounds, and there was needed a way to get people farther from the center of the city than those areas that they can walk to. For example, there was a rail yard in West Albany that was a huge installation and obviously needed workers. And also in that area there were stockyards. And down in the south end, right at the Normanskill, were the Kenwood Mills. And then there was the need for a connection to areas to the north, along the canal and into West Troy, which we now know as Watervliet, and to Troy itself as well as Cohoes. So the first line was incorporated by the state on April 15th, 1862, and it authorized the Watervliet Turnpike and Railroad Company, which was a turnpike that we now call Broadway. In other words, that was a toll road where if you got beyond the city, you had to pay a toll in order to use that road. But the tolls were going out of existence, so the companies had to figure out another way to make money. So becoming the Watervliet Turnpike and Railroad Company was a way for the company to preserve its existence. And they were authorized to lay a track in Broadway and then, of course, beyond the Watervliet Turnpike from South Ferry Street to the village of West Troy, which is now the city of Watervliet, a branch to the lumber district, which was along the Erie Canal, what's now Erie Boulevard, of the village of Cohoes, eventually, if was needed. They were required to keep the street pavement in good condition, and the fare within city limits was no more than 5 cents. There were travel restrictions on Sundays and on the carrying of freight, and the track had to be installed within 3 years of the incorporation. This also was authorized by the Common Council. And so on May 5th, 1862, the Common Council of the City of Albany authorized the Watervliet Turnpike and Railroad Company to build tracks within city limits. The requirements were that the cars would travel no faster than 6 miles per hour, horses would be walked around the corners, a 300-foot space had to be maintained between the cars, there would be free passage at crosswalks, substitution of sleighs during the winter, and the removal from the cars of any person, quote, any person intoxicated or otherwise who shall be indecent or scandalous in behavior or filthy in person. So the line was built and it began to operate in 1863. Shortly after that happened, residents of Hudson Avenue petitioned against the idea of building a line up Hudson Avenue. So these were not always favored. Sometimes they were opposed by the residents along the lines. The Watervliet Turnpike Company also petitioned to build a line along South Pearl Street to Kenwood, which of course was the place of Kenwood Mills. So in August of 1863, just around the time that the Watervliet Turnpike cars began running up Broadway, the Albany Railway was incorporated. And that was an outgrowth of the Great Western Turnpike Company that built Western Avenue, which goes from Townsend Park to central New York. And again, tolls were dropped, so these companies needed to figure out another way to make money. The first line that they built was up Central Avenue to West Albany, and also soon after that, a line down South Pearl Street to Kenwood. They were looking for other lines as well, but they didn't happen right away. So what you had at about 1865 or so was a line running from downtown Albany to West Troy, a line running from downtown Albany to West Albany up along Watervliet Avenue, and a line running down South Pearl Street to Kenwood, which was on the Normanskill. So again, the fare was set at 5 cents. So this image here is from the 1867 City Directory, and this is the first time anything like this shows up in the city directories. People know what city directories are. They're, you know, we're all old enough here, I think, to remember what a phone book was. So the phone books were, I guess I say phone books were an alphabetical list of people's names and phone numbers. The city directories, which are still published, are alphabetical lists of people, their addresses, their occupations, and they also have a section on businesses, which, again, referring back to phone books, would be sort of comparable to the Yellow Pages. And here you see an 1867 ad for the Watervliet Turnpike and Railroad Company. Now, the image that you see, the engraving, is probably a stock image. I'll bet if you looked in any city directory in the country that had its beginning horse car lines, you would see that same image, except that they put on the side of the car Albany and West Troy. They named the officers of the company. They named they indicate the schedule, and then at the bottom they indicate the fares. So as I said, the fare within city limits was 5 cents. Albany City to Tollgate, and I'm assuming that's got to be somewhere in Menands, 8 cents. Albany City to Cemetery or Spring Street, West Troy. Now the cemetery referred to the Albany Rural Cemetery, which was a place where people went Sundays for picnics because there weren't too many parks available. And it also says West Troy Spring Street. Spring Street is now called 5th Street in Watervliet, so it cost 15 cents, or no, I'm sorry, it cost 10 cents if you lived in Albany and you wanted to go to Ted's Fish Fry, which is in Watervliet at the corner of what's now 5th Street, then Spring. And then you can see if you went all the way up to West Troy, it would, in other words, the far end of Watervliet, practically to Green Island, it would cost you 15 cents. Soon after that, the Albany Railway began petitioning for additional lines. And finally, in 1874, a line was built up Clinton Avenue to Lexington. And around the same time, a line was built up Hamilton Street to Lark, left on Lark, and right on Madison to what's now New Scotland Avenue. So as Washington Park was under construction, there was also the beginning of horse car service to that area. So you've got kind of a couple more lines now. So you're going sort of in a clockwise direction, starting at Kenwood on the south, then Madison and New Scotland, then Clinton and New Scotland, and West Albany, and then a line to Troy as well. So in 1885, the Common Council the Albany Railway petitioned the Common Council to lay tracks in Lark Street between Madison Avenue and Washington Avenue. So what that ended up doing was, instead of going straight up and down Hamilton Street, the cars would go up Washington Avenue to Lark, turn left on Lark Street, and then join that line at the corner of Lark and Hamilton. So what happened again in 1889 was that the Common Council received a petition to begin electrifying the lines. And that was a huge change because, first of all, the cars could go faster, and eventually they could go for much longer distances. There was one of the things that happened at this time I thought was very interesting. The Common Council was very interested in the transportation system through the city. And there was an alderman elected at large who just happened to be a landowner at the end of Madison Avenue at Allen Street. He was also very much pushing for the extension of the Madison Avenue line from New Scotland Avenue to Allen Street. Now, we don't want to talk about a conflict of interest here, of course, because he owned land at the end of the line, but pretty much that's what it was. He had very much an interest in extending the line. And actually, the same thing happened a few years earlier on Clinton Avenue, where one of the large landowners on Clinton Avenue, also was an officer of the Albany Railway. So, of course, they were interested in pushing the lines as far as they could in order to make their land more valuable for development. So, in 1889, it was passed that these lines could be electrified. Poles were placed in the streets, wires across them, and in 1890, they were changed from horse cars to electric cars. And this image, again, you can see that the two companies were not exactly competitors because they didn't overlap in their coverage, but you can see it's the exact same image. And the Waterloo Turnpike, you can see the car says Albany and Troy, so they've crossed the bridge by this time. On the bottom it says Manan Cemetery in West Troy, so again you can see the cemetery as a place to go for recreation, to have a picnic. And then the Albany Railway, West Albany, and of course they had other lines as well. Now one of the things about the Pine Hills neighborhood was that it was very much a creature of this trolley system. In the 1890 city directory, that's right around the time Pine Hills was being developed, and that's it's literally at the end of Madison, right where Madison and Western join. And this Alderman Pratt, who was on the Common Council Transportation Committee and landowner, they must have bought ads in the city directory, because on every page of the 1890 directory is an ad for Pine Hills. It says, for example, 6 miles of frontage on new and beautiful avenues for sale in Pine Hills, easy terms, the best real estate investment in Albany, lots are worth 25 to 50 feet per front foot in Pine Hills, street improvements at Pine Hills, the best in the city. And then it says what I thought was the best part of this: Pine Hills is 2.5 miles from the post office Lark Street line. So they're clearly advertising that you can get to Pine Hills by way of electric car. So as I said, in 1890, these cars began to be powered by electricity. And just to give you an idea of the wonderful things that the Albany Public Library has, this is a little commercial here. This photograph, this original photograph, was recently donated to the library, and it's dated October 26th, 1890. And I used to have at this spot what ended up to be only part of this photograph. It shows the men posing at the, in front of the 2 horse cars. This is at the foot of Tenbrook Street. You're looking onto Clinton Avenue from Tenbrook Street. But when the new photograph, the new original photograph showed up, it actually shows that behind the 2 horse-drawn cars is an electric car. And I think that this really, the reason they're posing there is this symbolizes the end of the horse car era and the beginning of the new electric era going up Clinton Avenue. Now, we never really think these days about Clinton Avenue being a suburb, but prior to the 1870s, when Clinton Avenue, the Clinton Avenue line was built, there was very little construction west of Swan Street. And that's really, in fact, I think it was really west of Hawk Street. And that's because who wanted to walk up that hill? So when the horse car line was built up Clinton Avenue to Lexington, almost overnight, the row houses that we see there now were constructed. And they were, for the most part, middle-class houses, people that could afford the 5 cents that it took to get the car to go to downtown. So by 1890, not only are the cars electrified, but some of the lines are expanded. In that year, they brought the Lexington Avenue line, Clinton and Lexington line, up to Clinton and Quail. And then they laid tracks across Quail Street to Madison Avenue and brought the Madison Avenue line up to the same location. So for people who are familiar with the way Albany's trolley system and bus system used to work, you could probably figure out that we've got the West Albany line, we've got the Belt line, we've got the Pine Hills line, and we've got the Kenwood line, and then of course we've got the line from Albany to Troy and Watervliet and Cohoes. So the bus system that we came to know in the late 20th century, all of that is getting built by almost 100 years earlier. In 1899, the Watervliet Turnpike and Railroad Company, the Albany Railway, and the Troy City Railway merged. Does anybody have any idea what the name of the new company was? The United Traction Company, you got it. And I think in their incorporation they said it was going to last for 1,000 years. It made it to 1972, I think, so it wasn't quite that long that it lasted. But for those of us who are old enough to remember the United Traction Company, yep, we sure do, right? So soon after the turn of the century, there was clamoring for more lines. And the next line to be built was Delaware Avenue. It was begun in 1901 and operational fairly soon after that. In addition to that, the Schenectady Railway, which was a completely independent company, came into Albany. And they had an arrangement with the United Traction Company that they would not have to build a second set of tracks, but that they would have a reciprocal arrangement that once you got to Watervliet Avenue, the United Traction Company tracks would be used by Schenectady Railway. And what the United Traction Company did around the same time was extend their service to the city line, so that about where the railroad bridge is where the city line is. So United Traction would run up to that point, and Schenectady Railway would run beyond that all the way into Schenectady. And coming into Albany, the Schenectady Railway was not allowed to pick up passengers within city limits. That was the responsibility of the United Traction Company. So soon after the Delaware Avenue line was constructed, there was clamoring for another line on 2nd Avenue. So by 1906, the 2nd Avenue and Delaware Avenue lines were both completed, and they intersected at the corner of Delaware and 2nd. The Delaware Avenue line went a little further to about where the thruway is, because that was where the city line was at the time. At the same time, the Pine Hills line, which extended to Madison and Allen, was extended even further to the Country Club. And that, of course, is where the university is today. The last line to be built within city limits was on Pembroke Street and Livingston Avenue. And that was granted, in 1906 and didn't last very long. By the 1920s, it was already being removed. So what happened was you have this, a certain amount of desire for trolley service. In fact, in 1911, the people of New Scotland Avenue were clamoring for a line there. But by that time, I think that the idea of these electric streetcars was fading. And the United Traction Company refused to build a line on New Scotland Avenue. So the neighbors on New Scotland Avenue got together and formed the Woodlawn Improvement Association Transportation Company, which ran a bus on New Scotland Avenue. So that was the first bus in the city, within city limits. In 1925, a Capital District Transportation Company was formed, and that was a bus company that was a wholly owned subsidiary of the United Traction Company, and their first line was Western Avenue. So they ran a bus up Western Avenue to the Country Club, and at the same time they dropped the trolley service from Manning Boulevard to the Country Club. So Western Avenue is the first bus service within the United Traction system. They also began, as I said, to remove some of the trolleys from other streets. So the Kenwood line, the Livingston Avenue line, and I guess that's it, were removed in the late 20s. So through the 30s, the lines that remained still, in fact, I think the Troy line, the Cohoes line, and the Schenectady line were also dropped as trolleys in the 1930s. The idea was that there would be no trolley service in the city before the beginning of World War II. However, with the war preparations going on and the possibility of gas rationing, 5 lines remained in place until 1946. They were the West Albany, the Belt, the Pine Hills, the Delaware Avenue, and the 2nd Avenue. So, as I said, they lasted until 1946, and on August 31st of that year, Mayor Erastus Corning powered the Belt Line through the intersection of State and Pearl on its last run. So what I would like to do now is talk a little bit about what happened as a result of the trolley lines. You know, we talk about transportation systems, and transportation systems are followed by development. If you think about the Northway and what the Northway did to Colony and Clifton Park and beyond, you realize that those towns were very rural and very sparsely populated until the Northway came along. Well, in the same way, Delaware Avenue and West Albany and so on were sparsely populated until the trolley lines came along. So one way to think about this is when you look at a street and you see a bunch of, let's say, two-family houses like Myrtle Avenue or Washington Avenue or Quail Street or wherever, you realize that there are no driveways there. And that's because those houses were built along the trolley lines. So if you go down Myrtle Avenue from let's say, Allen Street or up Morris Street from New Scotland, you'll see that those houses are really close together, and they are accessible to the line that ran on Madison Avenue. The same way with Delaware Avenue, where, you know, from 1900 to 1920, it went from a farm road to virtually identical to what we see today. And so these cars really had major impacts on the city development.
Thanks again to Tony Opelka for sharing his knowledge and expertise. Tony is a frequent visitor of the local history room. To find out when the local history room is open and when you can meet with Tony or our local history librarian, visit our website or give us a call. Since 2012, Matt Millett has been researching and sharing Albany history content through his @Albany Archives Twitter account and Facebook page, and through his popular website, albanypostcardproject.com, which includes a number of postcards from our library's local history collection. Over the years, he's also developed 4 Albany I Spy events, which are historic and architecture-themed scavenger hunts through the city. For over a year now, Matt has been researching and starring in a series of local history segments for Spectrum News, where he's covered a variety of topics such as the gargoyles on the SUNY Administration Building, the history of the first Christmas card in the U.S., which was printed in Albany, and Albany's historic Masonic Lodge. Stay tuned for part 2 of tonight's Albany Made podcast, Albany Archives, The Full Story.
Okay, so Albany used to bobsled. But it wasn't just Albany. Most northeastern cities had some sort of bobsledding. Troy had bobsledding. They outlawed it in 1886, 3 years before Albany did. Schenectady had bobsledding. That was just kind of a thing because in the 19th century, people drank. And when you drink, you do dumb things. And you find a telephone pole and you put some metal sleds on and you say, let's go down a hill. It happens. But there's a lot more to this story. I'm not going to get too deep into it just because I would be regurgitating what Christopher Lindsay, who did a lot of research on this, you know, for the last 20, 25 years. So I mean, if you want like a more in-depth, there's a video that he did a lecture of about 4 years ago from the New York State Library. And he goes into much further detail. So I mean, I'll touch on some stuff that I found and some stuff that we detailed on our own segment. If you ask anyone, Albany is not the origin of bobsledding. It is St. Moritz, Switzerland. It sounds so romantic that it's a European sport. And it's not true. It's a complete lie. Everything that you have known your entire life about the origin of bobsledding is a lie. According to the International Bobsleigh and Skeleton Federation, and this is backed up by the Olympics, in 1897, the world's first bobsleigh club was founded in St. Moritz. How about that? Because by 1885, Albany's Coasting Association, which is another word for bobsledding, They went by bobbing, they went by bobsledding, they went by coasting. It was all the same sport. They had about 40 clubs within the city area, and that was 12 years prior. In 1884, there is an ad, a Christmas ad, that reads, "From Santa, I care only for strong, healthy lads who ride downhill and go out bobbing, and they need to be protected." Santa was looking out for our dumb children. In 1886, bobsledding really took a big turn with these winter carnivals that Albany was doing. 1886, 1887, 1888, and 1889 being the last one when Charles O'Hara was killed by a stray bobsled that went into a crowd. Switzerland claims that we are the creator. Stephen Whitney, who was, by all accounts, an Albanian. He's buried in Albany rural. He went to Switzerland in 1889 because Albany had banned bobsledding, and he was now just kind of globetrotting. He was on vacation. He was seeing the sights. And he went to Switzerland in 1889, and somehow, shortly after 1889, the Swiss now knew how to bobsled. Coincidence? I don't know, probably. But when we went up to Lake Placid to shoot the second half of this segment, so there's two parts. The first half we shot in Albany with Samantha Hall, who is the executive director of Tenbrook Mansion over in Arbor Hill. So we did the first half with her, where she discussed how all of these hills were built perfectly for bobsledding. They were steep. There weren't any cars. I mean, you had carriages and horses, but you didn't have automobiles, going up and down the streets. I don't believe, and if anyone was here yesterday with Tony's talk about the trolley, I don't believe Madison Ave had a trolley yet in the early 1880s. If they did, then they told them only go down on Sundays.
Probably did.
Did?
Yeah.
So you really only had to worry about that. But it only ran at certain times of the day. It may not have even run on Sunday. I know bobsledding. Oh, Tony's here.
Yeah, they were horse-drawn at that time.
They were horse-drawn?
Yeah, so before 1890.
There you have it.
They were a lot slower. And they weren't on Madison below Lark.
Oh, okay.
They were only on Madison above Lark.
Okay. So they were bobsledding on trolleyless streets. So you have that going in, and we don't really know the specific origin of bobsledding. We know that we gave it a kick, but we don't actually know where it started. In the story we said that Adirondack loggers would come down to Albany in the winter, and they would do their lumberjacking in the Arbor Hill area. We don't know if they brought it down with them. We just don't. They just never kept records. When we went up to Lake Placid, we met with John Lundeen, who was the public relations guy for the Lake Placid IOC. And he said, "Oh, what do you do in your story?" I said, "Oh, bobsledding. How it started in Albany." He was like, "No, it started in Lake Placid." So what? No. I go, but we can agree it didn't start in Switzerland. He's like, "Oh, absolutely. Just don't tell the IOC." He goes, he's like, Whitehall claims they were the origin of bobsledding. So there's 3 towns right there within 2 hours of each other claiming that they all created bobsledding. So how many other towns out there? I would presume most Adirondack towns at some capacity said, "No, we had bobsledding. We threw the wood on the sled. We had one jerk that said, 'Hey, I'm going to ride it down like Slim Pickens,' And that's just, everyone probably has the same origin. But through the years, when once it was banned in 1889, what happened? There had to be bobsleds. They weren't using them, but they had to be around. And in Lake Placid, there is an actual Albany bobsled. And it said it was run on State Street. How accurate that is, I don't know, because it also said it ran in 1900, which we know now that's not true. So it could have been a Madison Ave bobsled, it could have been a State Street, it could have been a Lark Street, it could have been a second street, it could have been anything really. I don't think they were probably, specific to a street. They probably went all over the city. So what happened? We don't know. Somewhere along the lines, it was banned, it became popular, and Albany missed the boat. Okay, so the Ladow Mansion. It's pretty crazy. It was built in 1891. I believe the Ladows moved in 1892. And it had a pretty non-conspicuous history for probably until about 1910, 1920. Ladow died in 1904, a week before Christmas. It was December 17th, 1904. He was 57. So he wasn't exactly young, but he's not clearly of an elderly age. He was a working inventor up until the day he died. He dropped dead of a heart attack on Central Ave. He was on his way to Washington, D.C. to meet Cyrus McCormick. Now, that's not probably a name that you recognize, but he is the founder of International Harvester, which is farming equipment, and that's what Ladow focused on. He made every farmer in America's life easier. He had hundreds of patents. He was one of the most prolific inventors of the 19th century. I believe he had the most patents of the 19th century. The problem was when he dropped dead of a heart attack a week before Christmas, he was essentially broke. That's kind of an MO for inventors. They like to live lavishly, and he really was no exception. He did not believe in life insurance, and he spent the money as quickly as it came in. So not more than 2 years later, the family was evicted from the home, and that was pretty much it for the Ladows. His son, Charles, had to quit college. He was going to Princeton, and he needed to start making money for the family. His wife, who had never worked before, she was now a school teacher, and they were just living in a very modest home after that. He had, I believe, 5 kids. There was Charles Jr., there was Alice, there was Marion, there was Platt, and there was a young one, a 5th one, who died in the home. So there has been rumors and speculation that the house has been haunted since 1894. When I was there, and we're going to put this right to bed because I know it's haunted, I did not witness anything. However, there was a framed document from ghost hunters that had been there, saying that it is indeed haunted. From what I gathered, he died from asphyxiation. Natural gas lights were something new in homes. And there was a gas leak in the kid's bedroom. And that was it. He didn't wake up. So he was a young kid, but as far as I know, I believe he's buried with the rest of the family. Anyway, I didn't really have this turn morbid, but there was a lot of death in the house. Not awful, cruel death, but there was a lot of death. As far as I know, I believe every owner died in the house. So in 1906, I believe it was October, the house was auctioned off in front of City Hall. And surprisingly, nobody bought it. It sat vacant for about 5 years, which is kind of what's happening again. In 1910, a woman by the name of Mary Hunt bought the house. She was the second family, and they were there by far, the Hunt family was there by far the longest. They were there for about 37 years. So the Ladows, even though it's called the Ladow Mansion, they were only there for about 13 years. The Hunts, they came from Hillsdale, which is in Columbia County. It's a one stoplight town. If you took away the telephone poles, you would think it was 1890. All the buildings are old. They're all they're beautiful. I recommend driving through. Don't blink. She bought it by private sale. And with her came her very old mother-in-law and her son, Leslie. The mother-in-law, she died in 1921, one day before her 104th birthday. Her bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and there was no elevators. So she would do those stairs at 103 every day. Her husband, Ruth, the mother-in-law, he was one of the founders of Hillsdale, which is how they afforded the house. 10 years later, Mary died, and the house went to Leslie. This is where things get interesting. Leslie was labeled incompetent by psychiatrists. The rest of the family said Leslie was not incompetent and that he was faking it. There was about $200,000 that could be had if Leslie was competent. So the cousins were looking to get money. And out of the blue came Leslie's wife. Leslie wasn't married. But the woman that claimed was married to Leslie also thought, oh, there's $200,000 to be had. Yeah, I'm married to that guy. Leslie was, by all accounts, a hermit. He never left the house. He was always in the house. He had a chauffeur. As far as I know, the chauffeur actually didn't drive him anywhere. The chauffeur, he was a Colony guy, Ed Betts, I believe his name was, and he was with him until he died. And he died in 1947, give or take a year. It was either 46 or 47. He was 74 when he died. And by that point, the house was trashed. You had a guy that was living there for 20 years, incompetent, living off of inheritance. And the house was auctioned off again in 1949. And they had a buyer this time, and that was the Wires family, John and Sarah Wires. And they were the ones that put all the money in to restore it back to how it looks today. They fixed all the parquet flooring. The ceilings were caved in. The roof, parts of the roof was gone. They put all that money in. And if you notice, did you notice that old picture? There's this giant tower. That tower was restored. But in the current pictures, there's no tower. Somewhere along the lines, that tower was removed. In 1957, a little thing called SUNY comes along. And they say, hey, that's a nice house you got there, Sarah Wires. That's ours now. You can get out. Through eminent domain, SUNY took the house, paid them, told them to go away, and that became their administrative offices. So Sarah Wires, after putting 8 years of hard labor into this house, was shipped down the street, and she moved into the Van Rensselaer mansion on State Street, which was one of Marcus Reynolds' famous architects, one of his first homes. So she moved there. So she wasn't really hurting. If anyone wants to know what it is, if you're ever going down State Street and you're by the park, there's a building that looks like it's made of coral reef. It's that building. She moved there. So in 1958, 1959, SUNY moves in, and best guess is they were the ones that took the tower down. Probably it might have been in the energy crisis, I don't know. We could not find record as to why. And then in 1977-ish, SUNY said, this castle is too small. We need to go to a bigger castle. So they moved down to the old D&H headquarters, and they are now in the largest castle in Albany with a giant Henry Hudson half-moon weather vane on top.
Our podcast is produced by Sarah Clark, engineered by Ryan Slowey in the Albany Made Creative Lab. Theme song by Ryan Devine. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Albany Made podcast. Thanks again for listening.